Sometimes people get a big head and it's no good for anyone. Sometimes you let somebody get away with something too much, and it gives them a much bigger head than they should be allowed to have. Please forgive me for having speech problems right now. So after World War II, a lot of Germans were disgusted, absolutely disgusted by what they saw. Dwight David Eisenhower himself forced an entire village full of people to march through a Nazi death camp and to bury the dead. Many of those people went home afterwards and committed suicide. Yeah. So after the war, before Israel even became a state, Germany was supplying them. There was a lot of Mausers, about 100,000 of them. German Mausers. They came out of a factory, I believe, in Czechoslovakia. It was Jewish slaves, primarily, who were manufacturing these rifles by that point in the war. This is World War II, by the way, that I'm referring to. And many of those Jews decided they were going to make the front sights off by a little bit. That's an awful lot of rifles that potentially had their sights off. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Because if you did every single one, it'd be something that would get you caught immediately. Anyway, after the war, the ones that people had realized the sights are off were on sale. And the Jews ended up with them. A lot of Germans, during the course of World War II, helped out Jews with escaping. Many of those people ended up dead, but not all of them. Sorry, I'm peeling pieces of skin off of me. I was lit on fire, and it's turned into a crust. The skin underneath is repaired enough that I can afford to pull off the skin over the top and let it start really healing. Making sure to stay clear of the scabs. Anyway, let's get back to Eisenhower, right? What does he have to do with any of all this? Well, on multiple occasions, the people surrounding Israel decided they were going to invade Israel, or threatened to invade Israel, and Israel went, Now, there's two areas that are very important here. Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel repeatedly took the Sinai Peninsula and then gave it back. Over and over and over again, they gave it back. Repeatedly, all of the nations around Israel, primarily because of a man named al-Nasser, who tried to use his charismatic nature. I mean, really, he was a hell of a used car salesman. Knew how to smile real big, had a nice, straight, pretty smile. One of the ones everybody wants to believe. He smiles a lot. He must be honest. He's got a straight smile. He must be honest. Well, unfortunately, al-Nasser ended up repeatedly having failing invasions. Why would you try to invade Israel? Why were the Egyptians, not Palestinians, why were the Egyptians repeatedly caught with their pants down? Because they thought that Israel was just well, basically the equivalent of podunk country folk, country bumpkins. That ain't the case. The Israelis didn't just sit there complacently. And the Germans kept on fishing stuff out of the pond, so to speak. The Germans helped broker the Israeli Air Force getting an airplane called a Mirage. The Germans helped to organize basically an underground railroad to get Jewish people safely between Germany and Israel after the formation of Israel. Now, repeatedly, the Muslim nations surrounding Israel set up invasions, much like the Russians did with Ukraine. The Russians put all those troops against the border, and you knew what was up, and they said that's not what was happening, but Ukraine was telling us, hey, they really are. They're setting up to invade us. And of course, the United States, too, said, well, Russia claims that it's just doing military operations and training, that it's not there to invade Ukraine, and then they fucking invaded Ukraine. That went well, didn't it? No, of course it didn't. Apparently those generals didn't pay any attention to history. Kiev was set up to withstand sieges from all sides. Going back to World War I. That's right. There's still World War I fortifications at Kiev. World War II fortifications at Kiev. Trenches from both wars at Kiev. And several wars since. Kiev, since its inception, has been one of the most besieged cities in the world. It's spent a lot of time under siege. Spent a lot of time at war. So, of course, we do have to give the Israelis credit for first strikes on a couple of those occasions. Sort of. And one of those occasions, the British and the French were landing some troops to... Oh, there's more skin. Peeling that stuff off there. Ugh. That's how it heals, though. Once it gets to a certain point, having that skin over the top isn't doing any good. Ugh. Gross. Right now, what we're dealing with is because Eisenhower wanted to pull his power and pull his weight. He actually ended up helping al-Nasser and all that Egyptian bullshit. All al-Nasser wanted was the eradication of Israel. I mean, it's not like he was asking for anything big. Eisenhower stopped an invasion that would allow Jewish people to eat. That's right. Al-Nasser was trying to prevent any and all Jewish shipping. The United Nations had to get involved once. And from 1957 to 1967, the United Nations had a humanitarian corridor. That's right. And a UN enforced border. That's right. And what was I telling you about yesterday? What should be done? Well, what was effective? UN guards at the border. Don't fuck with the United Nations. So, for 10 years, the Egyptians had to deal with the United Nations. There was no war, just peace. And shipping was allowed through. Then, of course, after a decade, Al-Nasser asked the UN to leave, basically stating that obviously it's peaceful. There's no more reason for them to be there. Obviously, there's no problem, no war, and Israeli shipping is getting through fine. And the United Nations says, okay. And they pulled out, and 10 days later, yep, sure enough, Al-Nasser shuts down the infrastructure and pipeline to Israel. How dare the Israelis exist? How dare they? This is an affront to Al-Nasser himself. And Dwight David Eisenhower was instrumental in all of it. You'd think that him being an American president, that he would be on the side of the Israelis, right? Isn't that what we teach? No, he was against the Israelis. But he did eventually lead the way for Lyndon B. Johnson to be threatening. Basically saying, yeah, we see that both sides are lining up for a war, and we're going to warn you, whatever side starts the war, it's going to be in deep shit with the United States, the United Nations as well. By this time, I believe the Sinai had been given back to Israel, or given back to Egypt twice. Okay, so what'd they do? Mind you, this isn't just Israel against Egypt in any of these situations. In all of these situations, these nations thought, well, you know what, we'll get a whole bunch of troops set up at the border and we'll all invade at once. That's not gonna fucking work. No, all you've done is lengthen your logistics supply train. All of these nations, logistics supply trains through miles and miles and miles of desert. And Israel, well, you just literally come to their front door to bomb them. Lined up all of your guns and pointed them all the direction of Israel. How do you think that's going to work out? What, you think those country bumpkins are just going to sit there and let you murder them? See, it was bad enough cutting off their ability to get food. But that's enough, isn't it? What are the Palestinians complaining about today? They want food. there's a difference between the Palestinians today and the Egyptians back then. There were no surprise attacks before. We cannot consider any of that surprise attacks because you cannot line up and mobilize to go to war after saying and starting so much propaganda and hate. The Muslim world made Jews out to be the worst thing to ever exist. Horrible monsters. Out to steal your children and shit like that. Like, some of their campaigns were insane. To warn the Egyptian people and the people of Syria about the evils of Jews. Yeah. Of course they use propaganda. So does the United States. And for that matter, so does Israel. Alright, let's not bullshit ourselves there. Eisenhower paved the way for the peace that we got later. If we can call it that. We didn't get actual peace until 2016, for a while, sort of. When I say we, I mean that peace in the Middle East affects all of us. So does war there. It's a distraction to all of us, isn't it? How many things have you allowed to happen in your own country in the last few days that you should have probably been paying attention to more than the war in Israel, more than Hamas? Well, how would you know? You've been paying attention to Hamas and Israel, so you don't know what you missed. You getting confused yet? Oh yeah, it gets a lot more confusing. And through all of it, Israel has had Germany backing them up. Germany, not the United States. German lawmakers spend a lot of time behind closed doors trying to help out Israel to be safe within Israel. The Germans have given the Ukrainians quite a bit, but not as much as they give the Israelis. That's not a joke. The Israeli army had panzers for a while. They also had captured enemy tanks. A few of them countries that came together after World War II to try to get rid of Israel. Well, they'd been at war with each other during World War II. Or, of course, were occupied by European governments that were at war with one another. Israel was able to get a lot of tanks that people didn't expect them to have. And it was a modge podge of them, too. Old Shermans. Old M3 tanks. The Lee tank and the Grant tank, both light tanks. I mean, this is stuff that's probably not going to stand up to the Russian, well, not the T-34. There were some T-34s that were in Egyptian service, a few more that were in Lebanese service. But for the most part, the Middle East, when the United States wasn't willing to give them any more stuff, the French weren't willing to anymore, and neither were the British, because all the Middle East was doing with it was targeting Israel. Well, then pretty much the entire Middle East started buying from the Russians. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? We can't get our tanks from the Americans, we'll get them from the Russians. Now, how did this prevalence of the RPG-7 and AK-47 come about? Not sure if you knew this, but most of those nations were equipped with German or British. That's right. Why is this? Because during World War II, there was a lot of German weapons to be had and a lot of British weapons to be had. Prior to World War II, many of these nations were British colonies. Like Egypt. Yeah. Who knew that? Egypt is basically a new country. Egypt is a newer country than the United States because their government ownership changed hands. Obviously, it's not the same Egyptian government that built the pyramids. Al-Nasser was just one of many assholes who just hated Jews. A lot of these places were real tight with the Nazis. Nazis hated Jews. Of course they were sharing that hatred. The Jews keep giving back what they should have kept by right of conquest. Their mistake is to repeatedly give the Sinai back to Egypt. Their mistake is repeatedly giving Palestine back to the Palestinians. They should have kept the Sinai the first time. They should have kept Palestine the first time. But they chose to be humanitarians towards their enemies. And here's why. Because their religion requires it. Here's something that every Jew is supposed to do, that none of the rest of us are taught. They are taught to pray for their enemies before they pray for themselves. You're supposed to pray that your enemy be not your enemy. But if he does choose to be your enemy, show him your fury. Pray that they not be your enemy. But if they choose to be your enemy, they have made that choice, not you. You can either lay down and take it like a bitch, or you can fight back. And World War II taught the Jews something that European history, throughout all of it, since the destruction of the Jewish state, 2,000 years ago. There's a history throughout Europe of going back and forth between Jew-loving and Jew-hating. There were laws throughout Europe that were made at certain times and certain periods that guaranteed that Jews would always have jobs. There were also periods of time where laws were passed to have genocide. A lot of people pretend that Nazi Germany was the first real attempt at genocide by anybody, and it's not. It's not even the first time that people did that. Just take a look at Denmark. Take a look at Spain. Take a look at the Holy Roman Empire. Even the French had their Jew-hating period. And the Jew-hating out of the English continued through much of World War II. Did you know that? It wasn't until confirmed and verified atrocities by the Nazis against the Jewish people that anti-Semitism started to truly wane in Europe. Many people, the Germans did this too, were not Jewish. And after having gone through it themselves, they had a little bit more sympathy and a little bit more humanity for the other victims. One person who didn't try to understand was Eisenhower. Even after the horrible atrocities committed against the Jews that Eisenhower got to see the aftermath of firsthand. He got to see the corpses, and he got to see the walking dead. I don't mean brain dead, undead zombies like in the movies. I mean people who were so sickly and emaciated that they'd be dead within a few months at most for many of them. Lyndon Johnson ended up being a good buddy too. Sort of. Being able to have the United Nations there to give 10 years of peace. That was a wonderful thing. The UN was put there because of sanctions by Egypt just because of the existence of Israel. Of course, Israel fought back. You don't want Israel using those tactics against you. Don't use those tactics on Israel. Number 1, don't target civilian populations. Number 2, do not hide your military infrastructure within civilian installations. Number 3, when you invade and get your ass kicked, then invade and get your ass kicked, and then invade and get your ass kicked, and then play victim, you're a fucking idiot. Don't fuck with Israel. And for surely don't fuck with civilian populations.